Thank you all so much for coming. There's nearly 400 of you signed up for this. 400 beautiful people. I see each and every one of you, whether your camera is on or not. Thanks for being here. It's 3:03 Eastern here at the East Coast headquarters of Sounds Profitable here in Boston. And I'm incredibly excited to present this research because I think it's high time coming. I think it's something that everybody in the podcasting industry is really going to be able to use. So at the beginning of this year, like I'm sure a lot of you started to see a lot of real negativity around podcasting. There's certainly economic slowdown that we're currently a part of. There are layoffs. I mean, there are various pressures here, and they're certainly real. They're certainly not unique to podcasting, and nor are they even endemic to podcasting, but podcasting certainly had its share of articles. But I'll tell you what's not declining and what's not in a slowdown, and that is the audience for podcasts. In fact, it's bigger than ever, even as audiences for broadcast media continues to decline. But podcasting needs to do a better job of articulating to advertisers exactly what the unique benefits of this medium really are and what podcasting can add to an advertising buy. So we talk a lot about the kind of qualitative benefits of podcasting, right? The engagement, the pristine environment for advertising, the intimacy. We talk a lot about intimacy. That's a drinking game, I guess. But I'll tell you what advertisers are not necessarily buying. They're not buying intimacy unless they're shopping somewhere else. They're not buying intimacy. They're buying tangible brand health benefits, right? They're buying things that they can actually take to the bank, like awareness, consideration, favorability, and did this ad actually drive an action? So to kick off the Sounds Profitable quarterly research series for 2023, we thought we'd take a hard look at exactly what podcasting can deliver to brands, to media buyers, to advertisers, to agencies in a real apples to apples comparison to broadcast media. And we're going to talk specifically today about commercial AM/FM radio and linear television, network and cable television. Now, we chose those two because it's a clean comparison of sorts, right? In display, we talk about impressions and clicks. With YouTube, it's 5 seconds and skip. But radio, television, and podcasting are largely in the same game to capture a listener's attention or a viewer's attention for 30 or 60 seconds at a time to transmit a meaningful message for a brand. So all three of those media are kind of in that game. So we wanted to take a look at all three of those media in a real kind of apples to apples comparison. And that's exactly what we did with the medium moves the message. So the medium moves the message is a comparative assessment of advertising from broadcast to podcast. We've got a lot of great data to share with you, a lot of data about some of the leading brand advertisers in this country. But before I get to that data, I want to thank our wonderful partners in this effort, all 10 of them, as you can see here. It's one of our primary goals at Sounds Profitable to get broad support for the research efforts that we undertake here, so they aren't seen as advocacy research for a particular company or a particular point of view. I think it's really easy for a company to look at an effort like this and say, well, what's in it for me? But these 10 companies, they saw our vision, and instead they asked, how can we grow the entire space for everyone? So before we get started, thanks to all of our partners from all walks of podcasting life. We have publishers like NPR, Wondery, SXM, and our newest publishing partner, ESPN Podcasts. Thank you. For marketing and listener acquisition, we welcome Mopod. For brand suitability, our partners at Barometer. We have AudioHook, a demand-side sales platform to buy ads in podcasts. And of course, from the monetization side, we have Soundrise, who also just joined us this year. And podcasting wouldn't be podcasting without BetterHelp, who not only spend more than anyone else in podcasting and ads, they're also investing with us to help the entire space grow, to learn why it all works. And I also want to thank our research partners in this grand adventure, Signal Hill Insights. And it's been a real pleasure working with Jeff Fiddler and Paul Rispendell and everyone at Signal Hill. I really appreciate their wisdom and their excellence, frankly, in helping us realize this project. And part of what they did And we'll be sharing all of this at the end of this presentation, so you can pore over this to your heart's content. But the heart of what Signal Hill fielded for us was a large study. It was a 2,000 plus person study, 2,002 people. I insisted on those extra two, by the way. They're lovely people. Americans 18 plus, weighted to the census, so it's representative data of the population. And we asked them a variety of questions about their usage of the three media platforms that we're going to talk about today, their perceptions of them, their perceptions of advertising on those platforms. But the heart of it was a look at a number of brands. In fact, we looked at the 5 leading advertisers for each of those 3 channels by share of voice. So we're looking at the people who dominated frequency in commercial broadcast radio, in linear television, and in podcasting. We sourced the TV and radio advertisers from publicly available data from iSpot and Media Monitors. And we'd like to thank Magellan AI for sourcing the top 5 advertisers. And this is for 2022, all of this in podcasting. So here are some of the stars of our show today. For TV, we're going to look at Domino's, Geico, Liberty Mutual, Progressive, and Subway. In radio, we'll look at Indeed, ZipRecruiter, Progressive, again, Upside, and Babbel. And in podcasting, BetterHelp, Shopify, Athletic Greens, Progressive, and McDonald's. And really, there are some wonderful opportunities for us to look at kind of omni-channel advertising and cross-platform work as well, because as you can see, Progressive was a top 5 advertiser for all 3 channels. But also you have brands like Geico, which certainly was very active in podcasting, and brands like McDonald's in podcasting, which are also very active in broadcast radio and linear television. So all of these are going to be parts of our show here in a little bit. But first, I want to take us back to all the way back to February 12th, 2023, long ago. Well, not so long ago. It was a very special day. It was a day when a lot of us gathered together in the same place to watch the big game. And I have to call it the big game. It's my understanding that lawyers from the NFL will gut me like a trout if I use its title here. But the point is that many of us in this country, most of us in this country who have television sets, gathered around them and watched the same program. We all watched the big game. Now, some of us watched the game so that we could actually see Rihanna and Rihanna's performance at halftime. That's one segment of the population. Some of us watched the game. As a hardcore New Englander, I was not impressed. Some of us wanted to watch the Super Bowl ads. I think I could certainly slot myself in that category. And of course, a few of us, and I do slot myself in this category, watched it for Extreme's Nuno Betancourt to play those 3 magnificent power chords before they cut away. That's February 12th, 2023. And that's the last time that we all gathered together to watch the same thing. And maybe it will be until the next Super Bowl. Who knows? Audiences are bifurcating. Audiences are pulling apart. And certainly that's true of broadcast and podcast audiences. The broadcast audiences, the mainstream core audiences for commercial AM/FM radio and for linear television, are pulling apart from the mainstream audience for podcasting. And that's especially true with younger demographics. And by the way, I'll just answer one question that I see in the Q&A box. Will this recording be available after? Yes, it will. The recording and the slides will be available for download at soundsprofitable.com. So you can grab that then, but only when I'm done. So pay attention, class. So the reach of podcasting is growing. That's one factor at this, especially with younger demographics. And I'm going to show you the reach by demographic group for podcasts, AM/FM, broadcast AM/FM radio, and linear television. And these are the percentages of each demographic that each one of these 3 media reaches. So on the right, you can see in the 55 plus demographic, 74% of 55 plus Americans were exposed to linear TV in the last week, 68% of 55 plus to AM/FM radio, and podcasting has a great opportunity here, 55 plus. That's just blue ocean. That's one of the things that I talked about on stage at Podcast Movement Evolutions last year. So There's a huge opportunity there. But where I'd like to focus your attention is on the left side of this graph, 18 to 34, where the reach, this is actual reach now of podcasting, is starting to approach that of both radio and TV. And that's a combination of radio and TV losing some people in those demographics and podcasting gaining in those demographics. So right now, podcasts reach half of 18 to 34-year-olds in this country compared to AM/FM radio, which, and this is weekly reach, by the way. This is weekly reach, not ever. 59% of 18 to 34s listened to the radio in the last week, and 54% watched linear TV in the last week. So the reach of podcasting, if you just wanted to buy reach 18 to 34, it's getting pretty darn close. But also, when you factor in all of these new younger people listening to podcasts, there's nearly a generation separating the podcast and broadcast audiences. And this, I'm not sure, has really been articulated in quite this way. Let's start with the overall reach, and this is weekly users. Now, on the left, you'll see the U.S. population. The average age in America for the U.S. population is just about 48 years old. So finally, I'm above average in something. That feels pretty good. If you look at the mean age for podcasting, the podcast audience on average is just about 40 years old, just a hair under 40. The mean age for linear television, all the way on the right, is a little over 50. And for AM/FM broadcast radio, it's almost 49 years old. So just looking at the average ages of weekly consumers of these various media platforms, the average age for podcasting is at least 10 years younger. But now let's look at the best customers of these three media channels. Now, in podcasting, we treat heavy users as those who listen to more than 5 hours of podcasts every week. For radio, it's more than 10 hours. And for TV, and this is a comment, it's more than 20 hours constitutes a heavy user. So if you look at the definition of all of these various heavy users, basically we're looking at 5+ for podcasts, 10+ for radio, and 20+ hours for television. And then you look at the average ages of the heavy users of these three platforms, you get a really remarkable statement. The heavy users of podcasting are nearly a generation younger than the heavy users of radio and TV. And this is kind of a crazy stat, honestly. If you look all the way on the right, the average age for the heavy users of TV is just under 59. For radio, it's 56. For the TV audience especially, that's the very tail end of the boomer generation. Those are kind of the youngest boomers. But if you look at podcasting, it's 37, which is sort of squarely in the middle of millennials. Not shown on this graph, skipped as always, we poor Gen Xers. But all of this means that the average age of the heavy user for podcasting is really a full generation younger than the heavy users for radio and TV. That's a significant difference. It's a significant difference, especially when you start to consider that the younger you go with the podcasting audience, the less likely they are to watch linear television or listen to commercial broadcast AM/FM. And that's really the other factor of the fact that broadcast and podcast audiences are pulling apart. The podcasting audience is increasingly less reachable by broadcast media. Now, I've taken you back in time a month and a half. I'm going to take you now back in time to 2003, 20 years ago. We all watched TV. Podcasts were just not even a thing, really. They were barely invented and certainly not monetized. And I'm just really going to talk about TV here. In 2003, we all watched TV. And I took a look at the top 5 shows in 2003. Number 1 was CSI, followed by American Idol, Friends, and ER, which I don't know, in my brain I thought were 90s shows, but there you go. The NFL is up there. And then there was also some reality show starring one of our former presidents, that guy. That was 2003. And the highest rated show in 2003, which was CSI, had a 15.9, almost a 16 rating. And what that means is that 16% of the households in the country that have television sets watched that show at some point during 2003, a 16 rating. Keep that in mind. So that was 20 years ago. Now, 10 years ago, podcasting's starting to be a thing, but the audience for podcasting, it's still sort of part of that same general audience for television. If you reach 100% of the audience for TV, you were likely to get 100% of the audience for podcasts as well. They were part of that circle. The top 5 shows in 2013, by the way, the NFL is now beginning to rear its ugly head and its power. The Big Bang Theory, NCIS, The Blacklist, and Dancing with the Stars. But the rating for the top show that year was not a 16. It was actually about a 12.5, 12.6. So that means that a smaller percentage of households were tuned to that number one show in 2013 than was the case in 2003. So that's 2013. Now, today, what's happening is the podcast audience is sort of ejected from the core. They are escaping the orbit of television, certainly, especially as you go younger. And today, if you look at the top rated shows and the ratings for those shows in 2023, you'll see that they're in the 9s. So we're gathered around the tube less. We're listening to podcasts more. And the younger you go with the podcast audience, the more likely that audience is becoming exclusive and not reachable through broadcast media. I'll show you a good example of this here with both the weekly users of AM, FM, and the weekly users of television with podcast users overlaid on them. If you just look at 18 plus, 12% of podcast listeners are not reached by AM, FM radio, and 11% of podcast listeners are not reached by TV. And that's weekly users, weekly listeners, weekly viewers. So that's 12 and 11% not reached by either radio or by television. That's 18 plus. Now, if you look at 25 to 54, those numbers go up to 12% and 15%. So the moons are pulling apart a little bit. And then finally, when you get to 18 to 34, then we're starting to get up to 20% of podcast listeners are not using broadcast media, whether that's commercial, AM, FM radio, or linear television. So there are absolutely some opportunities here. The podcast audience is younger, but they're also pulling away from these two broadcast media. So if you have a broadcast media buy, it's increasingly not duplicative, especially with a younger audience as they start to pull away. So we're seeing this pulling away of on-demand media consumers and broadcast media consumers. They're different dogs. They're reachable in different ways. How do these differences impact brands and advertising? Well, we asked a number of questions here about the perceptions of all of these brands and media platforms and the shows that are supported by these brands. Here's one of the first kind of big findings from this. We asked people who are weekly users of podcasting, network or cable TV, and AM, FM radio. Do you go out of your way to support the brands that support your favorite podcasts or shows or stations? 60% of weekly podcast consumers say they go out of their way to support the brands that support their favorite podcasts. That's compared to 48% of TV viewers who say the same thing about the brands that support their favorite TV shows, and 43% of radio listeners. Now, the TV and radio numbers are still pretty good, but obviously the podcast number here is quantitatively better in terms of positive feeling about the brands that support people's favorite podcasts. We also asked people to agree or disagree with this statement. The ads on this media platform, whether that's podcasting or network cable TV ads or AM, FM radio ads, does it make you more likely to purchase the products and services advertised? 43% of podcast listeners say that that's true, that the ads on podcasts do make them more likely to purchase, again, compared to 33% of TV viewers and 26% of AM, FM radio listeners. So again, there's a real thread here of positivity towards brands. And we've seen this before. We've seen this in some other studies. So this part of it is not necessarily new. I'm going to get to the reasons why this is actually true here in just a little bit. We asked people, how often do you pay attention to ads when you're using each of these media. So again, for weekly podcast consumers, how often do you pay attention to ads? And these are the percentages who say they always or often pay attention. Top two box, basically. A lot of these questions will be the top two out of 5 choices. So here, the percent who say they always or often pay attention to ads when using podcasts is 36%. With TV, it's 31%. And with AM/FM radio, it's 29%. We also gave them a statement. Are you more willing to consider products and services after you learn about them on this medium? And again, podcasting is in the front here. And we looked at this compared to YouTube online video. We looked at this compared to social media, and of course, television and AM/FM radio. And again, a higher percentage of podcast listeners say they were more willing to consider products and services after they learned about them on these various media. We asked a question about relevance. Do you agree or disagree that the ads you hear or see on this particular medium or channel are generally relevant to you? And again, podcasts are number one here just by a skosh over social media, followed by YouTube, television, and TV and radio are basically tied here. So we're getting positive support. We're getting willingness to consider, receptivity, and we're getting relevance. And again, this is not a sample of podcast listeners. This is a sample of Americans 18 plus. So we're not in any way quoting podcast listeners. Everyone is getting the exact same question, but the podcast listeners continue to be more positive about the brands that support their favorite shows. So we've seen some of these things before, right? We've seen other data that suggests that podcast listeners are very supportive of the brands that support their favorite shows. And we often talk about, as I did at the beginning of today, some of the reasons for that. And we talk a lot about the benefits of the medium. We'll talk about engagement and host-read ads, and again, intimacy if you're playing bingo at home. We talk about these things as sort of native to the medium, as native to podcasting, compared to things like radio and television. But those factors alone don't account for these differences. They account for some of the differences, but I would suggest that those factors, the engagement, intimacy, and things like that, actually might even be trailing variables of something else. And the evidence for that are how people responded to ads that actually were the same ads that you might hear on broadcast radio. 2 of the leading advertisers in podcasting are large insurance companies, Progressive and Geico. They're certainly top 10 advertisers in television. They're leading advertisers in radio, and they're both leading advertisers in podcasting. And in many cases, the ads that are running on podcasts are the same creative execution that's running on broadcast radio. So in those cases, we're not looking at something that's host-read or different. If you run an ad for Geico, you're likely taking the gecko, right? And if you run an ad for Progressive, you're likely getting flow in a lot of cases. So in many cases, they're using the same creative. But even in those situations with these 2 leading insurance brands, you see that favorability, and I'll show you consideration in a moment, is actually higher with the podcast-only audience. Now, for this question, we're looking at the people who say that they watched TV last week, but did not listen to radio or podcasts in the last week. And the same with radio and the same with podcasts. So we're calling them TV only, AM/FM only, and podcast only. It's people who only consumed that medium of the 3 in the last week. So we're looking here at the favorability ratings, top 2 box, people who say they're very or somewhat favorable towards both Progressive and Geico. And when you look at the television only audience, you'll see it's 34 and 32% for Progressive and Geico, say that they're favorable, very or somewhat favorable. You go all the way up to podcasting, and it's 39%, right? And in many cases, it's the same creative execution. It's the same type of campaign. It isn't necessarily a host-read live ad. It might very well be a pre-produced spot, right? But you're still seeing that bump with the podcast audience. That's with favorability. Smaller difference here. See a larger difference, though, with consideration. These are the people who say they are very or somewhat likely to consider using or purchasing either one of these brands, Progressive or Geico. Again, with the TV-only audience, Progressive is at 23% with TV and 19% for Geico. With AM, FM, it's 31% and 26%. And with podcasting, it's 36% and 31%. So it's more than just the particular impact of the medium and the fact that it's being listened to in headphones, because often, as I mentioned, some of these insurance companies are reusing the same creative. It's something different. And that's something different I've really already talked about. And those are the differences in audience. So we know that podcast ads work. Why do they work? Yes, engagement. Yes, pristine environment. Yes, intimacy. But I offer these three other reasons. First of all, podcast listeners, especially heavy listeners to podcasts, they're less saturated with ads, period. They're less saturated with ads in general. They're listening to more podcasts. Podcasts have fewer ads than radio and TV. The spot loads are lighter, and many podcasts that they listen to are commercial free. When we ask people if they have seen or heard an ad in the past week, amongst these 5 types of weekly users of TV, radio, social media, YouTube, online video, and podcasting, the weekly podcast listener, fewer weekly podcast listeners said they've seen or heard an ad in the past week than their counterparts who are weekly radio listeners or TV viewers. So in general, the podcast listener is getting fewer ads in their chosen medium, right? So that's point number one. They're just getting fewer ads in podcasts, so they're hearing fewer ads, period. Point number two here is that podcast listeners are also much more likely to watch and listen to ad-free premium content, whether that's premium TV streaming services that don't feature ads, paid music streaming services that don't have ads, or even audiobooks, which largely currently don't have ads. I think that might change. What you're looking at here, the blue bars on the left, the total population, and then weekly podcast listeners, and then heavy users of podcasts, those who listen to 5 or more hours a week of podcasts. 83% of heavy users, heavy listeners to podcasts subscribe to a premium TV service, nearly 3/4 to a paid music streaming service, and 45% say they listen to audiobooks, right? So this is a chunk of the population that is much more likely to listen to ad-free, premium, kind of sculpted content where they're avoiding ads, whether consciously or unconsciously. So they're getting fewer ads in these platforms as well. 90% of podcast listeners access some form of paid TV, music, or audiobooks in the past week. That's compared with 82% of weekly YouTube users, 79% social media, 3/4 of AM, FM, and a little over 7 in 10 network and cable TV. By the way, there's overlap in all of these, right? If you are a weekly listener to radio, you are also likely a weekly viewer of TV. But when you just look at the people who say they are weekly listeners to podcasts, 90% of them have listened to some kind of ad-free premium service or watched some kind of ad-free premium streaming TV service in the last week. And that's the highest amongst anyone here. So they're hearing fewer ads on podcasts. They're hearing fewer ads in general. So they're getting less saturated by advertising, period. And as a result of that, that makes them a little bit more receptive to advertising because they're not getting bombarded with it just by dint of the choices that they are making. And the last thing I'll point out here, I've already shown you that the podcast listener is a full generation younger, especially with heavy listeners, than the heaviest users of radio and TV. And it turns out there's a reason why brands like to target younger consumers. They use the term malleability, which I don't know if I love that. But they're certainly more positive about brands in general. And it might be positivity, again, due to the fact that they're getting less saturated with ads because of the platforms that they choose. But they're also just more positive in general about brands, and especially the brands that support their favorite shows and stations. Here's a little example of that. The data on this slide, again, they're marked TV only, AM, FM only, and podcast only. For each of those, it's people who listened to that medium in the past week, but not the other two in the past week. All the brands that we looked at, and I'm going to show you 13 or 14 brands here in just a moment. For podcast listeners, for podcast only listeners, the average favorability for all of those brands, whether they were podcast advertisers or not, is 34%. It's 28% on TV and 32% on radio. And the favorability for those who say that podcasting is their primary channel. They're telling us podcasts are what I listen to the most compared to primary TV viewers and primary radio listeners. That favorability, again, is highest here, 42% compared to 37%. And that favorability, again, is sort of top two box favorable attitude towards the brands that were presented. And that's the average for all the brands that we're going to look at. So the podcast listener is just generally a bit more positive about these brands. And these are the brands that we're going to talk about here in a moment. I showed them at the very beginning of this. I'm going to go into them in some detail now. When you look at the favorability rating for each of these brands amongst the entire sample, regardless of their favorite media platform, by the people who are aware of each brand, that's what the favorability looks like. And you'll see certainly some podcast advertisers in here do fairly well. McDonald's at the top, BetterHelp and Athletic Greens also. This is in the same order as awareness, right? So even though BetterHelp and Athletic Greens don't have as high awareness as things like McDonald's and Domino's and Subway, the awareness, the favorability of those who are aware of them is really, really high. Now, this is with the entire sample. This is 18 to 34. All of these numbers are a bit higher. If you go back to the total, Geico and Progressive are at 46 and 49%. BetterHelp and Athletic Greens are at 56 and 59%. 18 to 34, the insurance companies both go up to 51. BetterHelp and Athletic Greens go up to 63 and 65. All of these numbers go up a little bit, even for brands that are not heavy advertisers in podcasting. And that is a function of age. And in fact, if you look at 18 to 34s across all of these brands, they're about 6 percentage points higher in favorability for all of them. So it's, again, part of it is tied to the fact that podcast listeners are less saturated with ads on their favorite medium. They're less saturated with ads in general because of their propensity to subscribe to premium services. And they're younger, and younger Americans are just more positive about brands in general. So let's move on to the stars of our show. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on all of the brands that we looked at. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we looked at the 5 leading brands by share of voice in linear television, network cable television, in commercial broadcast AM/FM, and in podcasting. This is the awareness of each brand. I think most of us have heard of McDonald's and Domino's and Subway. Then towards the bottom, you have some of the real stalwarts of podcast advertising that have advertised a significant amount in podcasts. BetterHelp, Athletic Greens. This is with the total population 18 plus. So let's kick things off by looking at the top 5 television brands led by Domino's. Chances are, especially if you watch the big game that I talked about, you've seen some of these television ads as well. This is a pretty typical profile for a heavy advertiser on television, a ubiquitous advertiser on television. And you can see the effects here. We're going to look at 4 brand health metrics for all of these brands. We're going to look at awareness. We're going to look at favorability, consideration. Are you very or somewhat likely to use or consider purchasing? And then, did it drive an action? Did you consult something online? Did you use it? Did you purchase it? So starting with Domino's, we're looking here at people who did not watch TV in the past week, people who did watch TV in the past week, and then heavy TV viewers. Those are the 3 categories that we're looking at for all of these, right? So in terms of awareness, you absolutely see a difference in awareness between non-regular TV viewers and heavy TV viewers. That goes from 91% to 98%. You see that all the way on the left. You do see a little bit of a bump in favorability also. And you can think of this left to right as sort of descending into the funnel, right? Awareness is a real top of funnel measure. Favorability and consideration are real mid funnel measures. And then did you take an action? It's a lower funnel measure. So you do see that there's awareness being driven here by Domino's dominating share of voice in television. You go all the way over to the right, and you actually see a very slight decline here in the percentage that took action. And you're going to see that, I think, a little bit more starkly with a couple of the insurance brands. And there's a very good reason for that. Here's one now. Liberty Mutual. Liberty Mutual absolutely has increased its awareness. There's a significant difference here between people who are not regular TV viewers and people who are heavy TV viewers. That goes from 80% to 93%. So it's absolutely had an impact with awareness. It's had an impact with favorability. As you get to heavier viewers of TV, consideration and taking action actually fall off a little bit. And this is actually something that I've studied for, I'll just say, one of the leading insurance brands. And it can be a bit of a backlash. It can be a bit of a backlash due to the overwhelming amount of ads for some of these advertisers on television and across all media platforms. And you do see that a little bit. It's a fairly common pattern, especially in TV. So this is Progressive. Again, absolutely got a bump in awareness. And I don't want to minimize these bumps in awareness because the reach of television is still quite large, right? The reach of television is still twice what the reach of podcasting is for weekly consumers. So it's not just the numerator, but the denominator that you have to look at here. But awareness for Progressive went from 86% with non-regular viewers to 93% with heavy viewers. But then again, you see it a bit of a muddled picture in the middle of the funnel, and then it actually goes down lower funnel, which again might be part of that over advertising backlash that a heavy viewer of television would get. You get a similar picture here with Geico. Again, hard to believe that there are people who have not heard of Geico, but absolutely there was an awareness increase between non-regular users and heavy users of TV. And again, we see that potentially a bit of a backlash in the lower funnel measures as people perhaps get tired, who are heavy viewers of TV, get tired of Geico ads. And then Subway get a little bit of a bump in awareness, but did decently in favorability and consideration, and kind of flat in taking action. So that's what the 5 leading television advertisers by share of voice saw. And again, we're really looking at sort of apples to apples here. People who did not watch TV in the last week, people who are not regular TV viewers versus regular users and heavy users of TV. Those are the 5 TV brands. Now let's look at the 5 leading brands for AM/FM radio by share of voice. Indeed, bit cloudy here. Would not really say that there was an increase in awareness, would not a little bit of an increase perhaps between non-listeners and heavy listeners in favorability, a little decline actually in consideration, and a decline in taking action. And part of that might just be the utility of that brand for the broadcast radio audience. Not everybody can use Indeed, but certainly a lot of us do. And I think that's true with Upside as well. The picture is very cloudy here, I think, for Upside, which again was one of the leading advertisers by share of voice. And for here, we're looking at people who did not listen to radio last week, people who did, and people who listen for more than 10 hours a week, the heavy listeners to radio. So a bit of a cloudy picture here, a bit mixed for Upside. Now, ZipRecruiter, very successful campaign for awareness, and certainly successful for favorability. So ZipRecruiter, probably a new brand to a lot of radio listeners, and absolutely successful in terms of top of funnel measures, which again, radio does very well at that. Radio is exceptional at efficient reach and frequency, and especially with a brand like ZipRecruiter that had not, 5 years ago, been a significant advertiser in broadcast radio. They absolutely see some effects here at the top of the funnel, less so sort of towards the bottom of the funnel. But I think for the goals of this campaign, they'd probably call that a success. Babbel, again, fairly new to broadcast radio, did well across the board here. Almost doubled awareness between non-listeners to radio and heavy listeners to radio. Gains in favorability, gains in consideration, gains in taking action. So with the brands that have not sort of super saturated all of these channels, radio absolutely has some positive impacts here, again, especially at the top of the funnel. And then we're back to Progressive again. Similar pattern, Progressive, fairly ubiquitous in terms of awareness, and a bit of a mixed picture when you get to the middle and lower funnel measures. And again, potentially backlash, because again, that orange bar on the right are heavy listeners to radio, probably heard a lot of Progressive ads. All right, let's look at the 5 leading podcast advertisers. And frankly, there's a lot of home runs here in all 4 of these brand health measures. Let's start with BetterHelp, the leading advertiser in podcasts last year. Nearly 5 times difference in awareness between people who did not listen to a podcast in the last week and people who did. I think that's a home run. But also look at favorability, consideration, and taking action, right? Those are all significant multiples over people who did not listen to podcasts in the last week. So in the case of BetterHelp, podcasts, yeah, they drove awareness, but they really shine middle and lower funnel, especially compared to what we've seen for TV and radio, which do different things, frankly. So I think BetterHelp here, in any way you slice it, had a pretty good year as far as these brand health measures go. Shopify is not a brand that everybody is going to use. They certainly increased their awareness with the podcast audience, but again, it's in the middle and lower funnel measures where you see enormous differences between non-podcast listeners, podcast listeners, and heavy podcast listeners. Triple the scores in many cases between non-regular listeners and regular and heavy listeners. So Shopify saw enormous middle and lower funnel effects here. McDonald's, interesting brand, right? They're, again, a very ubiquitous brand. Everybody in the sound of my voice has probably had some McDonald's at some point in their life. Awareness, it's pretty hard to beat McDonald's awareness. That was probably not the goal of the campaign. But look at the middle and lower funnel measures. They did increase. And if you go back to some of the really high volume, ubiquitous advertisers from television and several that were in the radio section as well, you did not see an increase in favorability, consideration, and action as you got to the heavy users of those platforms, where perhaps they may have been super saturated with ads for those platforms. You didn't see that, but you do see that in podcasting. Why? I talked about it earlier. They're not hearing as many ads, so the environment is not saturated. They're not hearing as many commercials in their lives because they are more likely to subscribe to premium services. And they're also just more favorable about the brands that support their favorite podcasts than the concomitant numbers with radio and television. So McDonald's does very well here. And then Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens, really a podcast native brand. I have a bottle right next to me, although this is not brought to you by Athletic Greens. Currently, I am brought to you. Awareness, huge increase here, almost 6 times the awareness between those who did not listen to a podcast in the last week and heavy listeners. But the multiples here in favorability, consideration, and taking action are more like 13 times or 12 times, right? So enormous differences, middle and lower funnel. So all of this adds up to the real role of podcasting in a media buy and the value of what podcasting can give you in a media buy. First of all, it gives you a unique, additive, younger audience to an existing broadcast media buy. No better example of that than to look at the people who are, and again, we're calling them TV only, AM, FM only, or podcast only. That's in the last week. That's of weekly usage. That doesn't mean that the podcast onlys have never watched TV. But the mean age of the only users here, TV only 55, AM, FM only nearly 48, podcast only 36. When you start to combine them in a buy, when you start to overlap them, you bring the mean age down of a broadcast media buy. You bring a TV and radio buy down to 41.7, a radio and podcast buy down to 39, a TV and podcast buy down to 37. And as I showed you earlier, the younger you go with the podcast audience, the more likely these are additive, net new consumers, net new audience that are not currently being reached by TV and radio. So adding podcasting to an existing buy, an existing broadcast buy, lowers the mean age of the buy, reaches new consumers. It also can enhance a television buy or a radio buy with increased mid and lower funnel benefits. And I know certainly when you looked at the TV numbers, some of those numbers looked small, but again, keep in mind, the reach of television is much larger. So even a small percentage increase in awareness is still millions of people. But if you layer in a podcast buy on top of that, it gives you enhanced middle and lower funnel benefits that you don't get from just a TV buy or just a radio buy. And I'll go back to the insurance companies here. And I showed you this graph already sort of sequentially. But again, if you add in the podcast audience into a buy for even something as ubiquitous as an insurance ad, you get an audience that is more likely to be favorable, more likely to consider that brand. I showed you these already. But also, if you add in the podcast audience to the TV audience, add it in to a radio audience, all of these numbers come up considerably. If you only look at TV and radio users in favorability, the favorability numbers for Progressive and Geico are 44 and 39%. That's all the way on the left. If you add podcasts into that, if you add that podcast audience into that, it really increases those numbers up to approaching 60%, right? That are favorable or somewhat favorable towards those brands. You see that in consideration as well. So layering podcasting into an existing broadcast buy sort of buys you a little bit of a halo, as it were, on some middle and lower funnel benefits that you're not getting from a broadcast buy alone. And then finally, and I want to sort of summarize all of these brands in 4 graphs here for you. All 3 of these channels are in the same game. They're in the game of attracting a listener's attention or a viewer's attention for 30 seconds or 60 seconds at a time to transmit a meaningful message. Not a click, not an impression, not a 5-second skip, but a meaningful message that's meaningful to the brand, that actually transmits a value, that transmits a perception, transmits a call to action. And frankly, podcasting, whether it's part of a broadcast buy or by itself, simply drives favorability, consideration, and action better. And I'm going to wrap all this up by looking at the averages of the top 5 brands in each medium. So what I'm going to show you here, the top 5, the 5 leading TV brands in awareness showed an average 4% increase between non-weekly viewers and weekly viewers, right? So between non-weekly TV viewers and weekly viewers, the top 5 brands in TV saw a 4% increase. In radio, that's a 7% increase. And again, radio and TV do reach more humans than podcasts. So these numbers, even though the TV and radio numbers look the same or smaller than the podcast number, there's significant amounts of people that we're talking about. But the gap with radio was 7%, and the gap with podcasts was also 7%. That's awareness at the top of the funnel. Let us descend into favorability. The gap between non-regular viewers and regular viewers of TV in favorability, average amongst the 5 TV brands, 5%, amongst the 5 radio brands, 8%, and podcasts, 14% increase between non-regular listeners and regular listeners for the 5 top podcast brands. So significant differential here. Consideration, those top 2 box, willingness to consider purchasing or using the brand. Again, 4% with TV, 5% for radio, and 15% for the podcast brands. And now finally, where the rubber meets the road, especially in a medium that has been so historically driven by direct response and performance advertising, action. The difference in action for TV at 1% amongst the top 5 TV brands, with radio 6%, and with podcasts 16%. Enormous middle and lower funnel measures, whether podcasts are bought by themselves or whether they're layered onto a broadcast buy to reach a net new, additive, positive audience. So I'm going to wrap all this up. The reach of podcasting 18 to 34 is nearly that of radio and TV in this country. The median age of the heavy users of podcasting is a generation younger than the median age of television and radio's heavy users. Podcasting reaches a net new consumer when you add it to a TV or radio buy. And that net new consumer is more likely to be opting out of advertising. They're more likely to be hearing fewer ads on podcasts, and they're more likely to be subscribing to ad-free premium services. Podcast listeners are also significantly more positive about the brands that support their favorite shows. Some of that, again, is due to that lack of saturation in the medium. Some of that is due to the fact that they are a younger audience, and the younger audience is actually a little bit more positive about brands. The leading advertisers in podcasting perform significantly better with middle and lower funnel measures than the leading advertisers in TV and radio. And again, I looked at the top 5 share of voice brands in radio and TV and podcasting. So these are the brands that, if anybody is saturating these channels, those are the brands that do it. And podcasting performs significantly better, middle funnel and lower funnel. And finally, just adding podcasts to a multi-channel buy shows significant middle and lower funnel effects layered on to a broadcast buy, which I think makes it incredibly important, incredibly attractive to an advertiser, and incredibly valuable, I think, again, to reach a net new consumer. Once again, I want to thank our partners here, Signal Hill, for executing this study for us, BetterHelp, SXM, Barometer, Wondery, AudioHook, ESPN Podcasts, NPR, Mopod, and Soundrise. Thank you so much for your support in making all this possible, helping us grow the space as best we can. All of this data is going to be available for download at soundsprofitable.com. I believe it's already there. This exact presentation will be available as soon as the video gets edited and we add some avatar style effects and turn me into Thanos and some other things. I think, Gavin, get on that. And speaking of Gavin, I absolutely want to thank Brian, Gavin, and Manuela at Sounds Profitable for help making all of this look and sound good. And I want to thank you, of course, for the gift of your time and attention. I hope this is valuable for you. I hope everybody uses this. We're running out of time for questions. If you do have questions, hit us up on Twitter, email me. If you're a partner to Sounds Profitable, you can hit me up in the Slack channel. We'll try to answer everything that we can. But again, this is now available for download, so you can download it to your heart's content. We'll certainly be talking about it for the next several weeks, if not longer. But thank you so much for coming here. Really do appreciate it. And we hope we see you at the next Sounds Profitable event. Cheers.